Who is your inner critic? What is this voice that keeps chirping at you in the background? Blah, 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 blah. About you, how you can't do it. This isn't you. You're not cut out for this. You? I don't know. You? Oh. Who is this person? Who is this inner critic? It's like being at a baseball game and you have the umpire and the crowd at a baseball game. The umpire is the one that stands behind the plate, who's in the game, making the actual decisions, trying to call a fair game, trying to stay on track. And the crowd is in the background, chirping at the umpire, telling the umpire, what kind of call is that? Come on, Blue. You have the umpire, the decision maker in the game, and you have the crowd, the inner critic in the background. And there's this layer effect between the two. There's this layer effect between the two of the decision maker and the inner critic. And it's important that we make this distinction here. Okay? Because the umpire is ultimately the one that decides the game. The umpire is actually calling the game. And the crowd barks at him, chirps at him, criticizes him in the background. And I can't even imagine what the umpire must hear throughout a baseball game. It must just be mind games, trying to get in the umpire's head, the crowd, the fans trying to sway the game to their team's side, right? And the umpire's just got to stay focused, drown out that noise, and just focus on the game. And maybe there are some calls where he doesn't make quite the right call, it's a little off, and the crowd does have a point, right? The inner critic does have a point. And in that way, the umpire and the crowd can work together in harmony, okay? So just like the umpire, I can't imagine what kind of things that your inner critic is telling you right now. Like, what is your inner critic saying? Over the past few months, what has that been like for you? What are the stories that you've been hearing from your inner critic? About how you can't do it. About how this isn't you. About you? You think that you're capable of doing this? Your inner critic is fear, uncertainty, hesitation, anxiety, survival. So it's important that we make this distinction of your inner critic in the background and the decision maker in the foreground. The umpire in the game and the crowd in the background. So this is one of the most important distinctions that we can make, okay? Because when we think about getting the things that we want or becoming the person that we're trying to become, we don't make those things happen because of this inner critic, because we fall prey to the fear, the uncertainty, the noise in the background, the blah, 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 blah. The decision maker gets drowned out by the crowd in the background, causing us to not think clearly, make decisions with more ease and effortlessness, okay? So it's important that we separate these two, that we make this distinction. And how do we separate the umpire from the crowd? How do we separate the decision maker from the inner critic? We're going to get into that in a second. We're getting into that. So stick with me here. Be patient. We need to separate these two. Your inner critic right now might be loud. It might be very loud. And there may be zero distinction at the moment with your decision maker and your inner critic. There might be zero distinction. And the critic just might be blah, 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 making so much noise that you can't focus. You can't make a clear-cut decision. So you can think of your umpire as intuition, as the heart. You can think of your inner critic as the mind and thinking. Okay? The umpire, intuition. The inner critic, thinking. Okay? So again, think of the umpire as the heart, the intuition, feeling. You feel something to be true. The inner critic is thinking, mind games, and chatter. Okay? And they both have a part. They both play a role. But it's important that we make the distinction between the actual decision maker and the inner critic, the noise in the background. Okay? So your umpire right now might be hearing so much chatter in his ear that he is unable to call a clear-cut game, right? A well-called baseball game. And it's possible with this that there's zero distinction for you right now. So talking about some of these things just doesn't really make sense. Hearing me talk about these things doesn't really make sense, but you've stuck with me up until this point in the video because you feel something to be true here. And that's why I'm making this video, because of my own experience with these things. The power of creating a further separation between your inner critic and the decision maker, okay? So, with whatever you're trying to do with your business, with your sales work, moving into a different line of work, making decisions in your life, we need to separate the umpire from the crowd to make these decisions more heart-based, more intuitive-based, more feeling-based. When you feel something to be true, when you know something to be true, okay? So, how do we actually separate your inner critic from the decision maker? How do we separate the umpire who's actually in the game, making the calls, from the crowd in the background, okay? How do we make this distinction more clear? How do we comfortably house your inner critic? That's what we're doing here. Because this inner critic, this mental chatter, it can stay. It can actually stay with you. And you can actually make it one of your best allies, the most powerful ally for you, working in your favor. Where you can hear what the noise is saying, you can listen to the crowd, but it won't affect what you know to be true. It won't affect the right decision. Okay? And they can play in harmony. They can keep each other on each other's toes, right? So what's an actual practice? How do we actually put this into practice? What is something that we can do to create this distinction? How do we comfortably house this inner critic and allow this inner critic to stay? Because the inner critic isn't a bad thing. It's a part of you. So, how do we make this distinction? How do we make this a healthier relationship? Well, if you have a bad relationship with anyone, what's usually the best way to go about making a healthier relationship with someone? If you have a bad relationship with someone, talking and listening to that person helps. Most of the time, that's all you need. You just need to hear the person out. Like if you think about the baseball game analogy here, if you have the umpire and you have a fan in the background chirping at him, if the game was able to be paused and the umpire and fan actually had an interaction, like, oh, like, this is what I saw. The umpire says, this is what I saw. This is the decision I made on the call. The fan is like, what? No, it was off. And they were able to just talk it through. Things would settle down pretty quickly with that fan, okay? So this is how you want to think of your inner critic and the relationship you have with this inner critic, okay? So you want to sit down with your inner critic and hear him out. What does he have to say? Let him speak. Let the noise run. Let the chirping happen. And how do you do this? Before you go to bed at night, you sit down with yourself in complete silence and you close your eyes. And you just listen. You just listen to what your inner critic has to say. You let it run. Because if you have zero distinction right now between the heart and the mind, between the umpire and the crowd, then it sounds like your inner critic has a lot to say. It sounds like there's a lot of noise if there's zero distinction between those two. Okay? So if that's the case, you're going to close your eyes in silence and you're just going to listen to your inner critic just blah, 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 and listen to what he has to say. Let him speak. Because you want to know what happens eventually? Your inner critic eventually quiets down. The volume gets turned down. And that's where you can connect more with intuition, heart, the umpire, the decision maker. That's where you can make a further distinction between the inner critic and the decision maker, the umpire and the crowd, right? You can make decisions more clearly. You don't give in to the fear. You do what's required to become the person you want to become. That's what happens when the mind quiets down. But you have to sit down with yourself in silence, no distractions, nothing. And you have to let your inner critic speak. You have to have a table conversation with you and your inner critic. And you have to talk things through. You got to hear this inner critic out. And when you close your eyes, the thinking is just going to run. The noise is just going to run. Blah, 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 blah. Right? The crowd is just going to go blah, 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 blah. And you just listen, you just observe it. Your decision maker is just the observer. He just sits there like, okay. And you let the inner critic just speak, and eventually the inner critic quiets down. Right? You can think of it like eventually the crowd starts leaving the stadium when you do this long enough. The crowd gets quieter and quieter. The fans start leaving the stadium. Okay? Comfortably house your inner critic by going to therapy with your inner critic. Sit down by yourself. You go to therapy with yourself and you hear him out. Have this conversation. You listen to yourself. And eventually your inner critic talks long enough to where blah, 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 and it gets quieter. That's where you hit the next level.